Spirit is the content of its consciousness at first in the form of pure substance, or is the content of its pure consciousness. This element of thought is the movement of descending into existence or into individuality. The middle term between these two is their synthetic connection, the consciousness of passing into otherness or picture thinking as such. The third moment is the return from picture thinking and otherness, or the element of self-consciousness itself. These three moments constitute spirit. Its dissociation in picture thinking consists in its existing in a specific or determinate mode, but this determinateness is nothing else than one of its moments. Its complete movement is therefore this, to diffuse its nature throughout each of its moments as in its native element. Since each of these spheres completes itself within itself, this reflection of one sphere into itself is at the same time the transition into another. Picture thinking constitutes the middle term between pure thought and self-consciousness as such, and is only one of the specific or determinate forms. At the same time, however, as we've seen, its character, that of being a synthetic connection, is diffused throughout all these elements and is their common determinateness. Here in paragraph 767, Hegel is bringing a lot of things together in a rather metaphysical way. It's fairly abstract, so we have to do some thinking between the lines about what it is that he's talking about. In the next paragraph, of course, he's going to get a little bit more concrete and refer us back to some of the previous sections. And we could say that if we had to pick out what is the center point of it, it is this middle term, Mitte, right, which is Vorstellung, or representation, picture thinking, imagination, right? And what he's talking about here, though, are three moments of spirit, of Geist. And this is, the phenomenology of spirit, so it's really central to what we're trying to make sense of. And he's telling us about these three moments, and he says that these three constitute spirit. Now, is he talking about constituting spirit throughout the entire dialectical development of consciousness and the phenomenology? No, this is spirit at this point, but spirit articulated in one of its highest forms in religion, and specifically in one of the most developed forms of religion, the revealed religion. And revealed religion that actually has for us a revelation not just coming down from on high, coming straight from God itself, but rather revelation in a person, so Christianity. And these three different moments are all going to be spirit, and each one is going to, each of these different domains, you could say, or spheres, as he says, completes itself within itself, but they're all connected to each other. There's a transition that is going on. And he comes back to this picture thinking as being the middle term at towards the end of the paragraph, right? Picture thinking constitutes the middle term, the Mitte, between pure thought and self-consciousness as such. But then he sort of relativizes that. So we're going to come to that. So let's see how he lays all of these out at the beginning. And you could get a little bit confused because Hegel doesn't say 1, 2, 3. Instead, he lays out some stuff and then talks about a third moment and then talks about these three moments. But it's really not that difficult to see what is coming together here. What is the first moment? Well, the first moment has to do with pure substance or thought or consciousness, right? He says, spirit is the content of its consciousness, so Bewusstsein, the consciousness, at first in the form of pure substance. And then he says, or, so this means this is equivalent here, is the content of its pure consciousness. How should we understand this? The element of thought. Denkens, right? Something that has been driving this cart the entire time. Something that we saw earlier. We've got, thought, essence, existence, and being, and then we've also got substance, subject, self, right? So there's all these things that are being connected together. So here we've got the one side, pure thought, right? Pure thought of what? Well, the religious object, the divine, what it is that is most essential, the supreme being. And then this descends, herunterzusteigen, going under, going downward. It descends into existence, Dasein, or individuality, Einzelnheit. Okay, so that's the religious being taking on flesh, becoming incarnate, and being a person, not in the sense of the persons of the Trinity, as the second person of the Christian Trinity, but being a person in the sense that we're used to, somebody who can interact with you, right? Somebody who has agency, somebody who has a history, right? So he says that this is that at first. The middle term between these two is their synthetic connection, the consciousness of passing into otherness or picture thinking as such. All right, so there we've got our second moment. And the middle term, what it is that allows this descent, is what he's calling the synthetic, and this is just a cognate of synthesia. So Hegel is deliberately using this word synthetic here. He's not using the word synthesis, though, right? So, whatever stuff you've come across with Hegel's all about threes. Yeah, there's three here. And it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Well, this is interesting, right? Because the synthesis is not simply taking the, thesis and antithesis, the two opposites, and coming up with a better form of them. No, it's happening right there in the middle. And this is not a synthesis. This is a Verbindung, with synthetic qualifying the Verbindung or connection. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is a middle term. What's going on here? We're still dealing with consciousness. Consciousness of passing into otherness, anders werden, becoming other, right? So passing works, becoming other. How does one become other in terms of religion? Well, we've got the worshiper, the believer on the one hand, and we've also got the religious object, the person, in this case, the anointed one, the Christ, right? Teacher, healer, all sorts of other things that are going on there. And this is, as Hegel's saying, picture thinking as such. Picture thinking, representation, Vorstellung, not conceptual, not Begriff or, Begriffliche, but rather Vorstellen or Vorstellung or Vorgestellt, all of these things that have to do with the way in which we represent to ourselves. So this is the second moment. What's the third moment? The third moment is not a synthesis. It is a return, a Rückkehr, going back, a turning back towards what? Towards spirit, spirit becoming explicitly conscious of itself. And now we're no longer dealing just with consciousness. We are explicitly dealing with self-consciousness, right? The return into the element of self-consciousness as such, self-consciousness itself, Selbst. Then he goes on and says, okay, now these three moments constitute spirit. Its dissociation and picture thinking into the second mode, right, which is how it's descending into existence. Its dissociation and picture thinking consists in its existing in a specific or determinate mode. But this determinateness is nothing else than one of its moments, one of whose moments? One of spirit's moments. Spirit needs all three of these. We're not just jumping ahead in some sort of mysticism to, what is the real essence of this? Leave all this extra crap behind. No, this is all important. And Hegel goes on here to say that its complete movement, again, whose complete movement? Spirit's. Spirit's complete movement is this: to diffuse its nature throughout each of its moments as in its native element. Spirit is in each of these. It is not that representation is geistlos, spiritless. It may be, begriffslos, it's not yet conceptual, but it's not spirit lacking or anything like that, any more than this initial moment, the entering of the eternal into time, to use a lapidary formula coming from Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments. That is also spirit. He says each of these completes itself within itself. The reflection of one sphere into itself is at the same time the transition into another. So this reflecting on itself, we could say becoming self-conscious in a way, makes us conscious of the middle term of the Vorstellung. Thinking about the Vorstellung, the middle term, the representation, the becoming other, leads us to the return to the element of self-consciousness. Notice he doesn't say to return to self-consciousness. We're self-consciousness the entire time. We just didn't realize it. But the element of self-consciousness. And what is this element? What did self-consciousness teach us? Well, self-consciousness is self-consciousness in another, for another, right? You don't have self-consciousness all by itself, so it's relational. It's also desire, hunger, begierde, and desire for what? Anerkennen, recognition. That's all implicit here in this. Anyway, he goes on and he says, picture thinking constitutes the middle term between pure thought and self-consciousness as such. So now it's not just a middle term between thought and existence or individuality in this first moment. It is also the mediating term, the mitte, the means between this return to self-consciousness and the descent into individuality on the part of pure thought. So he goes on and he says, it's only one of the specific or determinate forms. So there's multiple forms here. At the same time, however, as we've seen, its character, once again, Hegel uses this deliberately chosen term, a synthetic connection, not a synthesis, a synthetic connection, a connection that is binding things together, bringing them together. Sun in the Greek is what we're getting synthesis from, is diffused throughout all these elements, and it is their common determinateness. Now, what does that mean? Even in the return is not a complete abandonment of picture thinking. It is going to be doing something further with the picture thinking, because the picture thinking, he says, is its character of being a synthetic connection is diffused throughout all these elements and is their common determinateness. So we're not yet past Vorstellung. The content itself, which we have to consider, has partly been met with already as the idea of the unhappy and the believing consciousness. But in the former, it has the character of a content produced from consciousness for which spirit yearns and in which spirit cannot be satiated or find rest, because it is not yet in itself its own content, or is not the substance of it. In the believing consciousness, on the other hand, the content was regarded as the selfless being of the world, or as essentially an objective content of picture thinking, of a picture thinking that simply flees from reality and consequently is without the certainty of self-consciousness, which is separated from it partly by the conceit of knowing and partly by pure insight. The consciousness of the community, on the other hand, possesses the content for its substance, just as the content is the certainty of the community's own spirit. There is a lot of reference to content, that is, Inhalt, in paragraph 768, and there's an interesting comparison going on between what we can call previous shapes or gestalten of religious consciousness, ways in which consciousness has understood or misunderstood itself in relation to its object, of religion. And Hegel is saying that at this point, something new is arriving on the scene. So if we want to think about, just pausing on the text for a moment, some of the implications of this, and we think about Hegel's project of bringing philosophy into history, looking at the historical development of consciousness, what we should think about is there being some overlap between these three different main shapes of religious consciousness in relation to Christianity and perhaps other forms of theism as well, so that it's not as if first in history there was the unhappy consciousness, and then only much, much later did we have faith, the believing consciousness, and then only much later do we have this consciousness of the community. No, these are all possibilities, but one of them is a little bit more possible at a given point in time. So the development of Christian doctrine and community itself, I think for Hegel, would be important in this. So he tells us this content, which we have to consider, has partly, and that's a key term right there, partly been met with already as the idea of the unhappy and believing consciousness. Two different shapes of consciousness, right? So partly, right, we are not radically inventing things, this has been dealt with to some degree previously, but you could say that its fullness hasn't been brought out. And if we go back to the previous paragraph and a little bit further as well, the picture thinking that is going on in these earlier shapes has turned out to be not quite adequate to the demands of religion, the spirit that wants to know itself through religion. So first we have the unhappy consciousness. This is the entire section ending the self-consciousness section after Stoicism, after skepticism, after the whole struggle to the death and the master-slave dialectic. The unhappy consciousness is the culmination of the self-consciousness section. And he tells us that it has a certain character, that's a way of translating Bestimmung, right? A certain thing that it's resonating with, responding to. And what is the essential structure of the unhappy consciousness? Well, we've talked about this before. He says it has the character of a content, an Inhalt, produced from consciousness, right? And so that produced hervorgebrachten, right? Spirit, consciousness, projects the religious object out there as the eternal into a beyond, a jenseits from the here, this, diesseits, right? There's this unbridgeable gap, and there's all these attempts to bridge the gap and to get there. And at the same time that spirit is, without realizing it, producing and projecting this religious object out there, it's also yearning for, Ersehnten is the way in which this content is being described. It is yearned for, right? Yearned for by who? By the religious believer who is spirit at this point. And he says that spirit cannot be satiated. It cannot find its satisfaction or find rest. Why not? Because it is not yet in itself its own content, or is not the substance of it, right? So it projects something out there as being not it, as being other than it, and it's going to seek for its satisfaction, which is really itself a reconciliation within that, and it never gets there, right? It gets all sorts of things, and it tries all sorts of means, but none of them are as effective as it needs to be. Okay, so that's the unhappy consciousness. What about the believing consciousness, the glaubende Bewusstsein, right? This is the thing that gets discussed in the spirit section. in relation, as faith, right? Glaube, in relation to the Enlightenment and insight. And it's something that is going to ultimately get left behind. And why? So he says, in the believing consciousness, the content was regarded as the selfless, selbstlose, not unselfish, but lacking a self, lacking agency, lacking the possibility of knowing itself. The selfless being, Wesen, essence of the world, or, another way of thinking about this, the objective content, Inhalt, right? Objective, Gegenständliche, of picture thinking. Picture thinking, Vorstellung, right? So the person who has faith believes in things. They believe in these representations which don't really match up to the world. Faith ends up being, you could say, more or less like an extra world that's tacked on, and it doesn't, and here's a key term, right? He says that this Vorstellung flees reality. Now, what's reality there? Wirklichkeit, the world that we actually know. Right? You know religious people like this. Oh, I have faith that this is going to happen and this means this. And you're like, okay, that's cool. How does that connect up with your everyday life? Well, it doesn't really connect up with my everyday life. I have my belief over here, and then I go off to work over here, and my, playing around with my companions over here, and my drinking and screwing over here, and all this compartmentalized world, right? Which isn't really a world. And faith becomes essentially fable. Of course, it becomes quite dangerous when faith turns into people trying to remake the world according to their crazy stories. Think about, all the damage that the Left Behind nonsense novels did with American evangelicalism, helping to sort of rot their brains with this drivel about post-apocalyptic this and post-apocalyptic that. I mean, those of us who saw these things coming out were like, well, who reads this crap? Well, that's a particular gestalt of the believing consciousness in our own time. And this happened in many other cases as well, during the Reformation, in a lot of different ways. And that's one side of the believing consciousness. Hegel's not really picking out on that. He's instead focusing on the ineffectuality of the believing consciousness, why it is that faith can be eroded by, as he's going to say, pure insight, right? So he goes on and he says, this is a picture thinking that flees from reality and consequently is without the certainty of self-consciousness. It lacks certainty. It has a kind of false certainty, but a certainty that can't really stand up to scrutiny, particularly self-scrutiny. You start having doubts, and then that faith crumbles. And it's eroded by its own conceit of knowing. It's Eitelkeit, right? It's you could say vanity of pretending that it knows when it doesn't know, and by pure insight that looks into it and says there's really just representations here that are not connected with Wirklichkeit, with reality. Now, what do we have beyond that? Now he talks about the consciousness of the community, the Gemeinde, right? Gemeinde should be. And the consciousness of the community at this point is what we're developing in this revealed religion section. It's not just the consciousness of revelation, Offenbarung, God revealing God's self. It's not just God becoming incarnate, teaching, talking, loving, dying, sacrificing, all of those sorts of things. It is the community, the Gemeinde, and this is not just a consciousness of the community, it is also a self-consciousness of the community that is developing. We, followers of, we, believers, we, yearners, it's becoming self-conscious of its own activity, of its own involvement. Where are we going with this? Of its own connection with divinity. So he says the consciousness on the community possesses the content for its substance. Unhappy consciousness didn't realize that the substance was it. Believing consciousness couldn't provide a substance. That's why it gets torn apart by pure insight. This provides a substance, and he says, just as the content is the certainty of spirit. But what spirit? Of the community's own spirit. Now, there's a really interesting corollary to this. Can you take this and sort of like strip it away and abstract from it and do it just on your own? No, you still need a community there, don't you? And this is where we could say the religious and the social and the political and the philosophical and the economic, and pick all these other things where we humans relate to each other, are going to be coming together. Hegel's not spelling that out here in this paragraph, but that would be, you could say, one of the implications of where this is all going.